Hello, J-Knights! You have reached part 2 of my tutorial on Volume 3, Chapters 1 through 19, and just a few more things I would like to review with you, and then we will finish talking about this novel. So there's a very important part that I would like to just kind of, bring to your focus, and this is the part when Mr. Collins sends a letter for Mr. Bennet, and he's trying to express a few sentiments in that letter. First of all, he would like to make it be known that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is not happy. I guess the underlying question here is, when is she ever happy? And then, of course, there's another part of that letter that I really thought you might want to pay attention to. And this part is the advice that he gives Mr. Bennet. He tells Mr. Bennet that he's well aware of the hushed up marriage between Lydia and Wickham. And then this is the part of the advice. He says, he writes, you ought certainly to forgive them as a Christian, but never to admit them in your sight. Oh, sorry, some typos there. I will fix that. Or allow their names to be mentioned in your hearing. This part was just very funny because I would like all of you to think about what Mr. Collins does for a living. Have you thought about it? Do you know the answer? We do know, yes, that Mr. Collins is a clergyman, and being part of the clergy means that, you somehow have a superior faith, and you're the preacher that others who might, not have enough guidance are supposed to turn to for that proper guidance. So his advice is forgive them, but don't ever see them again. And this is weird. This is a very weird advice to give, especially coming from a clergyman. So I would like you to think about the irony in his words. I went and I'm not like, a Bible expert, but I did find a part of the Bible that I'm sure Mr. Collins has read, which does say, for if you forgive men when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive men their sins, your Father will not forgive your sins. So I guess the underlying question here is, if, what Mr. Collins believes in so passionately and actually is part of his career, this is what he does for a living, and if what he believes is forgiveness, then which part of that forgiveness also includes to disown your child? Is that truly forgiveness? And that's the question that I'll leave you with, so that maybe you could think about some of the irony that exists here. These are all questions that may appear on your final, which is why I am giving you a little bit more emphasis here and just a general shout out. All right, now that important moment arrives, and we kind of see it coming just a little. Mr. Darcy is very hopeful when he comes back and visits with Bingley, and he's very hopeful that, maybe Elizabeth will like him this time around. And what he does is, he kind of goes about it very, very suavely, and he tells her, you are too generous to trifle with me. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me on this subject forever. Now, I just want to take a moment and draw your attention to the fact that this man has been accused of extreme pride throughout most of this novel. And an extremely proud person, would they ever put down that pride to propose to a woman twice after getting rejected the first time? So I think it takes a lot for a man to be able to do that. I mean, when I picture myself, I'd be like, oh, hell no, you rejected me once. I'm not asking you again. I'm not asking you again. But of course, there's Darcy who does ask her again, which means that whatever pride that maybe he was accused of having, maybe it was not an improper pride, which is what Elizabeth tells her father. And of course, Elizabeth does say yes. And Darcy reveals that what gave him hope to ask her again, to propose to her again, was none other than Lady Catherine de Bourgh. So that famous visit, the one that I allude to in right here in this slide, and we went over step by step, that famous visit had a series of consequences. She went to Mr. Darcy and basically, declared how awful Elizabeth was and how she absolutely refused her and her demands to reject him if he ever asked for her hand in marriage. And so imagine Darcy's thinking, wait a second, Elizabeth said this? So maybe I should propose again and this time she'll say yes. And he's absolutely right. And of course, one very important moment, and this is just such a big reflection of gentlemen during that time period, was the words that Elizabeth had really used against him when she had said that he's behaving, failing to behave in a gentlemanlike manner. It just really resonated with him and he couldn't get over it. And the reason for that is because we went over this earlier in my tutorials, that a gentleman had a few meanings during that society. Number one, a gentleman meant you're a landowner. You have the status to be a gentleman, like you're landed gentry. But secondly, a gentleman also means a man who has manners. And that was incredibly important too. Like in our society today, we use the word gentleman purely with the thought of manners. We don't really use gentleman in that, property owning definition anymore. So the fact that she said that he did not behave in a gentlemanly way just really hurt him. And he started to kind of do some soul searching. And he did realize that the way he approached her was definitely not gentlemanly at all. Now, I think that Mr. Bennet is an underrated character. He's often overlooked. He's always kind of annoyed with his wife and with his kids. But there's like this genuine moment that emerges, and I feel like it just shows us the talents of Jane Austen, that through her subtlety, she can really bring layers of complexity to these characters. So there's Mr. Bennet who, Mr. Darcy says, I would like your daughter's hand in marriage. And he's like, okay, I'm not going to say no to Mr. Darcy. But then privately, he professes to Elizabeth, please, don't do it. And all the while, he's thinking that Elizabeth doesn't love Darcy, that she doesn't respect him. He says to her, but let me advise you to think better of it. I know your disposition, Lizzie. I know that you could be neither happy nor respectable unless you truly esteemed your husband, unless you looked up to him as a superior. Your lively talents would place you in the greatest danger in an unequal marriage. You could scarcely escape discredit and misery. Basically, he's trying to say, like, there's no way that you would be able to keep your thoughts to yourself. I know how you are, and I don't think that, your lively talents, as in you have an outspoken personality, it would put you in great danger just because, your husband would not be okay with that. And then that line that really kind of gives me a pang. He says, my child, let me not have the grief of seeing you unable to respect your partner in life. Emphasis on the word you. And he kind of finishes his little speech by saying, you know not what you are about. And this is important because this is like a very subtle reference to his own marriage. And we do know that Mr. Bennet, when he was younger, was a very rational man, but he fell in love. And he fell for the beauty and for the lively, outgoing personality that Mrs. Bennet had. And even though she had no title, she had no connections, she had beauty. And that's what captivated him. And he didn't really care so much about the personality. But then, of course, you see that throughout their marriage, Mr. Bennet just kind of sank into oblivion, and he went into his study and just didn't come out. And that's what happens when you have a partner in life that you just can't respect. You distance yourself from them and consequently from his own family. And that's a shame to see. And Mr. Bennet realizes that, and he's warning Elizabeth, please let me not see you making the same mistake that I did. And I think that's a wise moment, and it often goes overlooked, but I did want to emphasize that because I don't think that Mr. Bennet is an entirely ridiculous character. I do think that he has ridiculous moments, but then he has such redeeming qualities you can't help but respect. Now, my last slide is on the fact that they all lived happily ever after. And I put some pictures from the 1995. This is my favorite version of Pride and Prejudice. The wedding, of course, the famous kiss at the end there. But there's also in the last few pages just like a summary of what happens to these characters. And we know a few things. First of all, what happens to Mrs. Bennet? She gets less agitated. She's always complaining about her poor nerves and about daughters not marrying. And finally, when her daughters get married and, she basically just has 2 daughters left who are at home, she's a lot more relaxed and her daughters marry pretty well. So she's satisfied. It doesn't say that she kind of does a entire personality makeover. She's not suddenly gonna become wiser, but she becomes less agitated. Let's give her that. Mr. Bennet, he goes out of his office more often, so that's good because that means he interacts with his family a little bit more. We know that he has more of a part in Kitty's upbringing, so he starts to take more of a parental role in the lives of his younger daughters, so Kitty and Mary. And then, of course, he also goes and visits Elizabeth in Pemberley, which is good. He's learning to socialize a little bit more. Mr. Bingley, at first we know that Mr. Bingley and Jane stay in Hertfordshire, but then they realize that they're way too close to the family. So what does Bingley do? He purchases an estate in a county beside Derbyshire, and that's where Darcy and Elizabeth live. It's truly a happy ending. You get your best friend to live right next door to you, and that's essentially what happens. We also learn that Kitty improves in her overall conduct, and that's because she's constantly staying with her elder sisters. So, she stays with Jane for a while. She stays with Elizabeth for a while. She has less exposure to Lydia. And of course, she becomes a lot more of a reasonable character. Mary, what can we expect from her? She starts to socialize more. She becomes more of a companion for her mom. Wickham and Lydia, and again, Jane Austen's not going to lie to us. They stay the same. They end up moving around a lot. There's Wickham trying to make money here and there. There's Lydia who tries to get money from her sisters, from Jane and Elizabeth. And essentially, they're not going to have their happy ending. And that's, what they deserve pretty much. Georgiana gets her happy ending because she lives with her brother and Elizabeth's like a sister to her. Lady Catherine condescends to visit Elizabeth and Darcy in Pemberley. And it does say despite its pollution, because if you recall, she accuses Elizabeth of polluting the estate. And finally, the novel ends with the Gardiners, who are frequent visitors to Pemberley. And I think there's an importance here in why the Gardiners are chosen as really the family that unites Elizabeth and Darcy as like the fairy godparents of Elizabeth, but also as the reasonable people, the level-headed, rational, respectable people who don't necessarily have those aristocratic ties, but they are just as deserving of respect and of honor. And I left you guys with a little video here that I think you will enjoy. It's a brief little funny recap of the novel, as well as a tiny little analysis. And I think you will really enjoy that little segment. So please check it out when you get a chance. And that concludes my little tutorials on Pride